United States President Joe Biden holds his major news conference. What were the big issues he addressed? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Joe Biden has given his first major news conference since taking office 2 months ago. He answered questions from reporters at the White House, and he covered a wide range of topics. Biden talked about everything from his response to fighting COVID-19 to the economy and immigration problems at the U.S.-Mexico border. He also addressed China-U.S. relations and his plans to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan. We have a great panel to discuss all of this. Joining us now via Skype from Maryland is Democratic Party strategist Joel Rubin. He is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama administration. Also with us from South Carolina is Eric Bolling. He is a best-selling author and national political commentator. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution, and he's the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. And with us too is CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King. Welcome to all of you to the show. Nathan, let me start with you. This was a highly anticipated news conference. The president covered a whole range of issues. What did you make of it and how the media handled him compared to those very contentious news conferences we used to see from President Trump?
Good question. I mean, what a difference a few months makes. I think it was highly anticipated by the press corps here at the White House because Joe Biden hadn't had a press conference in the first 65 days of his presidency, this being 65 now, and basically unlike any other president. And, you know, I'm still recovering from the freewheeling days of the Trump White House where we used to hang around here on the North Lawn as officials used to finish their interviews on Fox News and try and grab them. And generally we did, and they spoke to us, not always politely, but we had a good back and forth. It's very different here. It's very protective of the president. There's a new regime in town in terms of press availability, and I think it showed itself in the press conference. I think the press were looking for a man bites dog sort of clickable moment, and they basically asked dog bite man sort of questions. It was pretty sedate compared to the Trump era. Having said that, though, we have a president here who has been criticized for being a bit too old for office, 78 years old, and he was in command of the facts and some very detail, perhaps too much detail sometimes for the press corps on immigration, for example, but he held his own for about 59 minutes. He did filibuster a little bit while arguing against the filibuster in the Senate, but if I was going to give a scorecard, I'd probably say Joe Biden, President 1, Washington Press Corps 0.
Okay, Nathan, let's move on to some of the substance of what happened at this news conference, starting with the pandemic. The United States passed 30 million cases. That's no surprise, but the president did outline his vaccination strategy. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Yeah.
We will, by my 100th day in office, have administered 200 million shots in people's arms. That's right, 200 million shots in 100 days. I know it's ambitious, twice our original goal, but no other country in the world has even come close.
So, Nathan, how is Biden's handling of the U.S. coronavirus pandemic going to define these first few months in office?
Well, it's already defining it, and I think this is the big success of the Biden White House is to under-promise and over-deliver, which is exactly the opposite of what we saw during the COVID pandemic under the Trump presidency. I mean, basically 100 million vaccines. Remember, that's not 100 million people because it's essentially generally, unless you're getting Johnson & Johnson, 2 doses. So that's 50 million people in the first 100 days was probably achievable even under the Trump administration. And the fact that they have rolled out more vaccinations, rolled out to other sites, means that they can now promise 200 million in the first 100 days, and they're probably going to exceed that. I mean, what was the last day? 2.8, 2.9. We've seen 3 million days, and you're seeing it. I mean, you're seeing it across the country. Everyone knows at least 1 or 2 people now who have had a shot, and if you look at the polling, he's very much in positive in the American people's favor when it comes to his handling of COVID-19. I mean, obviously, you know, he's inheriting some of the infrastructure, although the current administration would argue against it, and also he's inheriting all the failures. You know, it was a pandemic that the likes of which the world hadn't seen in 100 years, and the lessons of the Trump administration. Having said that, though, it's been a pretty mature rollout. There have been some problems with some things, but nothing on the scale that we saw in the summer last year. So that is good. You know, in the end, though, it's going to come down to a race against time, isn't it? Vaccinations versus variants. And, you know, still the CDC is advising people, even if you've been vaccinated, to wear masks and everything. And I think they may get a point where when the majority of the American people have been vaccinated, that people are just going to say, I'm sorry, I don't want to wear this mask anymore. I want to get on a plane. I want to go on vacation with my family. So that's going to be a real test. And I think that'll probably happen around this summer. July 4th barbecue, as he said in his address a couple of weeks ago.
Joel Rubin, let's talk immigration. You know, there isn't a day that goes by when we don't see huge reports and pictures on the front pages of our newspapers of the situation on the southern border, the United States southern border with Mexico. Of course, the president was asked questions about the immigration situation at that border at the news conference today.
Yeah.
He blamed President Trump for handling that very badly, for the ongoing problems, and said that his approach was far more humane. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Of all the children who are coming across the border, over 70% are either 16 or 17 years old. We're not talking about people ripping babies from mother's arms or little 3-year-olds standing on the border. Less than, I think it's 1.5% fall in the category of the very young. So what we're doing is we're providing for the space, again, to be able to get these kids out of the Border Patrol facilities, which no child, no one should be in any longer than 72 hours.
Joel, should the president continue to be blaming the Trump administration for what's going on at the border? Should he be doing more to resolve the crisis there?
And he is doing a lot to resolve the crisis. And there's clearly a difference between the Biden policy and the Trump policy. The Trump policy was all about separating families and telling families that they would be punished if they came up here. And the Biden policy is about ensuring that people's lives are protected and getting an orderly program in place that was ripped apart by the Trump administration. You have to remember that the Biden team didn't even get an orderly transition into power. The Homeland Security Department, which is responsible for managing this, as well as at the Pentagon and Health and Human Services. So the system was destroyed and there was no transition. And now we have a president trying to enact a humane policy. And if you look at historical numbers, this is not out of the ordinary for similar seasonal surges in the past, including during the Trump administration, where they had a similar level of surge in 2019. And so this is about politics. This is about distraction. This is about Republicans trying to change the topic because they know how popular Joe Biden is, how popular his COVID policies are, how popular the American Rescue Plan is, and they're desperate to try to find a different wedge issue. And so they're playing in the immigration card, which is standard for the Republicans.
Eric Bolling, what did you make of what the president had to say on immigration? He says, look, I'm working with other governments. He's working with Mexico, for instance, to try and resolve the situation on the border there. But is the situation a legacy of the Trump administration, as President Biden points out, and as Joel Rubin pointed out just now? There was a very difficult, if non-existent, transition when Biden took office, just before he took office.
You know, Arnon, that's the problem with politics, and that's the problem with Democrats in America. In the same press conference, which, by the way, 65 days in office, 30 days longer than prior presidents took to get to the press conference. And I'd also like to point out, of all the questions that were taken, not one was taken from the right of center media organization. They are all center left or far left. Not one single from Fox, OAN, Newsmax, or the other right-leaning news services. So, but here's the issue. In that same 59 minutes, Arnon, President Biden took a victory lap for 100 million doses in people's arms, knowing very well that those doses were being developed under President Trump without giving Trump any credit. A few minutes later, he blamed Trump for the border crisis that is solely under his watch. When Trump left, we had about 25,000 to 30,000 apprehensions per month at the border. This month already, this month alone, 110,000, and we're not even finished yet. So you can't blame Trump for the border and then also not give Trump credit for warp speed and the doses going into people's arms.
Of course you
Just
can.
total Democrat hypocrisy in America.
Of course you can. Joe Biden came in and we were surging and peaking at COVID infections and had a boxed rollout of the vaccine. He's come in and had the government actually engage in organizing the states, in deploying FEMA, in using the Defense Production Act, in getting companies to partner in ways that the Trump administration not even contemplated.
Joel, the vaccine was developed under President Trump.
It was developed by the private sector.
People's arms
it was developed by the private sector.
Speed. You have to at least acknowledge that. I mean,
you can play politics
all you want and say
I acknowledge that the private sector developed the vaccine.
Arms, but he wouldn't have anything to put in people's arms unless it was warp speed.
All right, I want to go to Nathan. Nathan, before you jump in, I want to ask you about something that Eric Bolling just talked about, and that is the president. Sure. In fact, he took questions very much from the establishment Washington media, didn't he? Except that he didn't go to Fox, he didn't go to OAN, as Eric Bolling points out. He didn't go to any foreign journalist, did he?
No. By the way, I just love that exchange because it reminded me of exactly where Washington politics is and should probably get out of. And that's what Biden's trying to do, which I think is very clever, is sort of reach over the top to the American people. Let's see if it works out. But you're absolutely right. In fact, I don't want to tell you the sausage making that goes on behind closed doors here about getting a seat there. But I can tell you it's very, very difficult. I'm trying and trying and trying every time. And it is very much an elite list. There are two essential groups here that essentially decide that, and it's not the White House, it's essentially the established media in this country. Now, I'm very sorry that Eric thinks that Fox was shut out. They were, this press conference, but having been here during the Trump years, I can tell you Fox was the network where basically we used to wait by their cameras, 2 cameras down from here, until all Trump administration officials had been interviewed, and then we'd ask them difficult questions if they stopped and talked to us. So I understand that it may be frustrating after 4 years of basically exclusive access.
Nathan,
but that's
just
kind
be
of how it
fair.
goes sometimes.
Just be fair, Nathan. President Trump took a lot of questions from Fox and right-leaning media. There is absolutely no question about that.
Mainly
but
all
you and I will remember all the encounters that he had with Jim Acosta at CNN from day one. Every single press conference,
agree with you.
He took questions from people who couldn't stand him, who couldn't wait to see him get out of office.
Okay,
Eric, I just want to make one final point. Basically, Trump administration officials always went on Fox. Very rarely did they go anywhere else.
All right.
That's all I'm saying.
I've got to move on to Qinduo Xu, who is with us from Beijing. And Qinduo Xu, Biden was asked about relations between the United States and China. He talked about the very long conversation he had with Chinese President Xi Jinping shortly after taking office. Here's some of what the president had to say at today's news conference. Let's listen.
We're not looking for confrontation, although we know there will be steep competition. I see stiff competition with China. China has an overall goal, and I don't criticize them for the goal, but they have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch, because the United States is going to continue to grow and expand.
So, Qinduo Xu, this news conference came just a week after those meetings that took place between very senior diplomats between China and the United States in Alaska. And again, we heard from President Trump, the goal is not confrontation, it is competition. Is that selling in Beijing?
Well, I think a lot of people, increasingly more and more people understand, the relationship between the two countries. We know that it mostly will be defined by the policies from Washington. If Washington seeks cooperation with Beijing, then largely the relationship will be a cooperative one. But obviously, Washington is looking at the relationship as mostly competitive. And then, yes, we are going to see competition. Competition will be the theme in the future years or decades between the two most powerful countries over here. What at stake is really about what kind of competition. Competition is, for example, competition like what the U.S. has done, vaccination. That's a great success so far. And economic recovery or investment in infrastructure, etc., in technology. And Beijing is doing that too. So that's a very healthy competition. And what's a bit worrisome about, there's Washington is trying to build a united front, so-called, against Beijing. And during that process, I would say, hopefully, the two sides can manage that very well and not to spill over in the rest of the world, and country will be forced to choose sides and then global economic recovery will be somehow affected. So far, we are not seeing the cooperation on vaccination, global vaccination, or economic recovery. That's a bit disappointed, let's say.
Nathan, briefly, I want to get your view on this. You covered that meeting, or those meetings, I should say, in Alaska last week.
Yep.
And this is a very important question. Listening to what President Biden said there, that the United States will not let China become the dominant economy or the dominant power in the world. You know, on the one side from China, we hear about cooperation, about win-win strategies. And here again, we hear from President Trump about what seems to be a zero-sum game. Did he reinforce that view?
Well, basically, the Biden administration have three words, essentially, for the relationship with China. One of which is cooperation, but the other one is competition. The other one is being an adversary, if necessary. I can tell you there is a lot of continuation between the Trump administration policies on China and the Biden administration. It's different language. They don't mention CCP. They don't use words like kung flu, etc. But I can tell you, it is very adversarial. And as we saw, I was up there in Anchorage, Alaska, as you mentioned. The American diplomats are very surprised at the pushback they got from both Wang Yi and especially Yang Jiechi, the most senior diplomat in the China's delegation, who basically drew red lines and said, look, we're going to stand up to you now, because they hadn't been expecting it. They thought they could continue with the same sort of rhetoric. Now, having said that, there are areas of possible cooperation. And the first session of those talks, which were 3 sessions over 2 days, was adversarial. But they started looking for common ground, DPRK. That's very important, especially with the missile tests that we've seen in the last 24 hours. Iran and the nuclear deal. Climate change, of course, is going to be the big one. There's talk about some sort of working group, but we haven't got that. Let's see where it goes. But I think for China, what's most important is this trade thing. We've still got tariffs on over $350 billion worth of Chinese goods. We know that it's been terrible for the American economy. We know it's been terrible for the consumer. The facts are in. Let's move on that, and they want to see it.
Okay. Joel, this relationship, the United States-China relationship, it's been called the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Now, you worked in the State Department. You worked at, at a very senior level there as a diplomat. Where do you see this going? I mean, the rhetoric remains and still is very abrasive.
The rhetoric is hard. The rhetoric is tough. I think what we've seen with the Biden team is a willingness to use rhetoric in a diplomatic forum to lay out some lines and publicly message to the Chinese leadership that the United States, we have principles and values that we're going to advocate. But it also was, as we just described, a very constructive set of meetings. And this sort of realist approach to China is welcome, and it's a fresh air into the dynamic of diplomacy. You have to understand that for the Biden team, they articulate that diplomacy is a tool of American power, re-engaging the world, re-engaging our allies, building coalitions to advance our interests in a diplomatic way, and understanding that China, in this case, is a competitor in certain areas, a partner in certain areas, and we're going to speak our mind. And I think we saw President Biden do that today in a respectful way, but also in a way that demonstrated an American position.
Eric Bolling, the president, also talked today about rebuilding the country's infrastructure. He's talking about a multi-trillion-dollar effort to rebuild the country's infrastructure. The Republicans have not even stopped complaining yet about the stimulus bill that was just passed, the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. Now, will the Republicans work with him on this infrastructure bill that he's talking about?
I think that, you know, and I go back to the beginning of the Trump administration. Trump was a friend of mine, and I literally went into the Oval Office with him and trying to work into the infrastructure bill that they were trying to get passed in 2017. It never got through. He didn't push it through. I think there was a failure on Trump's part because he should have. And by the way, that would only have cost the government and the American people around $600 billion. It wasn't a massive, massive bill like what President Biden is trying to push through. The problem with the infrastructure bill is there's about $1 trillion of that bill that's earmarked for roads and bridges, which I think would get resounding bipartisan agreement to push that $1 trillion through and by all means fix our crumbling infrastructure. The other problem is that it could be up to a $4 trillion bill, which means $2 or $3 trillion additional dollars are being used, they're being pushed for green energy initiatives, for, in some portions, education initiatives, things that have absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure. They're couching it with education infrastructure, which is really a big transfer of payments. And that's where the Republicans are going to push back. So unless they can separate maybe $1 trillion or split it in half and use half for the roads and bridges, they'll get that through with the Republicans with a breeze, no problem at all. Manchin, they'll get that through. The other part, this redistribution of wealth and very progressive Democratic policies, if they lump them together, it'll just be one big Christmas tree, and it'll fail miserably, probably because Democrats will vote against it.
But Eric, will Republicans push back just because it's the Democrats who are advocating this? I mean, what's wrong with spending money with education or green initiatives?
Because we've been doing that, Arnon. We just dropped $1.9 trillion in COVID relief. We did another $1 trillion. It just, at some point, Republicans have to have some sort of win. They have to feel like they're part of the process, or there will be a massive red wave in 2022 in the House and the Senate, because Americans won't like a steamrolling of Democrats over all things that may seem centrist or even slightly conservative by the Democrats. It will get ugly for them in 2022 if they try and push a $3 or $4 trillion package that's loaded with climate change and education initiatives in it.
Okay, Joel, very quickly.
If I can add on this, I do think actually there's a misread, and President Biden talked about it today. Republicans on the Hill are disconnected from the polls about how Republicans feel about the COVID relief bill. And I think Republicans, as Eric said, would want to support infrastructure investments. And I don't know if Republicans on the Hill are going to support that just because of what they did recently on this COVID bill. And I think they're out of step with their voters and the American people, who we understand we have a lot of rebuilding to do here across the board to be competitive going forward.
Can I just add that it adds to this China strategy? Remember, Joe Biden essentially said a couple of weeks ago that China could eat our lunch of the technologies of tomorrow. And one thing he has said is that essentially China is building far ahead of the US when it comes to infrastructure. And this is something that is not just about Democrats. This is essentially what a lot of national security people are saying too. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, says we need to compete with China domestically. We need to be as good internally when it comes to high-speed rail, when it comes to green energy, when it comes to the industries of the future, semiconductors, etc., etc. And that is very much part of this. And I think that might help sell it on Capitol Hill too.
Okay, Qinduo, let's talk about another big foreign policy issue, and that is the nuclear issue in the Democratic Republic of North Korea. That's the DPRK. Biden was asked about that at the news conference. He was asked about what actions he might take or whether there's any red line that he has put down that he will not allow to be crossed. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We're consulting with our allies and partners, and there will be responses if they choose to escalate. We will respond accordingly. But I'm also prepared for some form of diplomacy, but it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization.
So, Qinduo, President Biden there saying that, look, he's got a very hard line on North Korea, but he is open to diplomacy. I mean, how do you see this working out? China, of course, has a big role in this as well.
Well, for North Korea, obviously, this is one of the important issue for the United States foreign policy. But so far, it's not one of the top priority. And North Korea is trying to enter any possible negotiation with the U.S. side from a position of a strength, let's say, using the word from the U.S. Basically, they are, yes, testing the missiles over there to draw attention from the U.S. Let's start a negotiation. Let's start to deal with each other. But I think, if you look at the past administrations, there are, tough policies at the beginning of the Trump administration, and then there are diplomacies, even summits between the two leaders over there. They ended in failure. So it's a tough challenge. For the U.S. side, from we see here in Beijing, we see that they would like to see North Korea would voluntarily give up the nuclear or all the weapons, and then they would start to lift the sanctions, etc. But the more acceptable way is you do things that do de-escalating measures on both sides simultaneously. But that process usually is long, and also it is based on political trust, but often the trust is lost. Remember, the U.S. administration often faces elections, or 4 years a term, and then at the longest 8 years. So it's difficult to implement, even you have a sound policy over there.
Nathan, let's talk about gun control. I expected to hear a lot more at this news conference, but we didn't, especially after the two very tragic shootings, the one in Atlanta and the one in Colorado as well. Horrific shootings over the past 2 weeks. What did the president say about gun control?
Well, also, can I just add, there was no question on the upsurge in Asian American violence either, which is quite incredible considering what we saw in Atlanta and have seen across the country. I mean, you only have to, scroll through your Twitter feed and see all the local instances and local news. So, yeah, I think essentially, it's a boring question for journalists in the Beltway because every effort, I'm sorry to get personal here, I was at Sandy Hook. You remember that horrific tragedy. And I was convinced then that all these elementary school kids being gunned down like that by an automatic weapon would essentially lead to some sort of gun control. And you remember Barack Obama came down and gave that very emotional speech, and there was a real push for it, and nothing went anywhere. And I suddenly realized that day that if not then when? And the answer is never. And I think that's where the press corps were. It's almost not worth bringing up. Now, the Bush administration, the Trump, sorry, let's get right. The Biden administration are talking about executive orders. They are talking about trying to push for an assault weapons ban, etc., which expired long ago after the Clinton administration brought it in. But we've been here before. The one exception I would say is the NRA is not as popular among gun owners as it used to be due to its internal scandals.
Okay.
But we'll see.
Okay, Eric, I want to get your view on this. I mean, the president said today in his news conference that he was elected to solve problems. Are Republicans going to solve these kinds of problems with him?
So, allow me just to clear up a couple of things. And I was there in Sandy Hook as well, and I understand that assault weapons are banned, and they are banned. Semi-automatic weapons are banned in America. Okay, so let's. An AR-15 is not an automatic
shoots like
weapon.
A duck,
it's not semi-automatic.
I mean, whatever.
But that is the true. That is listen. I'm a
whatever you want to label it.
Okay, one moment.
Advocate.
Eric, go ahead.
No, but allow me to finish. So all these calls for additional gun controls are being yelled at by people who don't even understand the existing laws. For example, there's calls for more background checks. Take the guy in Boulder, Colorado. The guy bought a gun 10 days with a background check prior to shooting up the grocery store, killing 10 people. More background checks wouldn't have stopped that mass murder. So when we call for more things, we should really be educated on what we're asking for and what we actually have in place.
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to end it there. Time has caught up with us. But thanks to all of you for being with us and for your views on the news conference today. We need to leave it there. Thanks for joining us on yet another edition of The Heat. We'll see you again soon.